The following is a presentation of NoVA Hackers, brought to you by Compute Cycle.
All right, thanks guys. I'm going to talk to you about software restriction bypass today. So first, who am I? I'm pwcrack. Twitter handle is @pwcrack, obviously. I'm a security engineer for Tenacity Solutions. We're always hiring. I'm a DEF CON goon, member of NoVA Hackers. Where's Rob? Yes, it's on my freaking slides. He's not here, so loss on him. Also a member of Unallocated Space. So what are software restriction policies? These are basically policies that you can set in Active Directory through your group policy manager. Basically say what the user is allowed to run and or not run. In Windows 7 and Server 2008, this is basically replaced with or appended to AppLocker. Right? AppLocker comes out and does this, but it exists earlier. The software restriction policies exist earlier. AppLocker doesn't exist until this level. And it's actually in Win 7 only Ultimate and Enterprise. We'll talk about both of those. So software restriction policy rules, basically I can set a hash of a particular type of file, an executable or a DLL, and say don't run this hash or only run this hash. It could be anything signed by a particular certificate. It could be anything at a particular path or subpath, or anything that's in a particular security zone. I could allow it this zone and not allow this other zone. The rules are going to be set up in terms of precedence. So for instance, if I wanted to whitelist something, the first thing I would do is blacklist everything and then add in the things that I want to allow. Or as a for instance, if I wanted to say you're allowed to do everything except X, then I would allow everything and then add in the things that you're not allowed to do. So you'd set up those rule precedents, and obviously depending on where the rule is in the chain or the tree will depend on whether or not it gets executed or not. Obviously if I allow everything and then deny something, allow everything that's going to play, so you have to switch them around to deny this first, then allow everything else. And once you allow and deny, then you can create exceptions and so on. You do all of this in group policy. AppLocker is basically similar with a slightly different group of ways of expressing the rules. There's hash, path, publisher, the publisher of the app. Same thing with rule precedence, and then allow and deny everything, and then create exceptions. So the problem with software restriction policies is the enforcement of this by the kernel is in user space. So enforcement function calls can be detoured to a different function over which we have additional control. So there's a tool on the internet called GP Disable, and it'll basically fool the software restriction policy code by returning an error whenever it sees a request passed to the hive. So a user with even a limited account who can execute their own code in any way effectively can completely bypass the software restriction policies. So it's give me any one type of code that I can execute. So it could be Java, it could be VB, the ability to execute pretty much anything, Office macro, and I'll be able to execute the code which is going to bypass the software restriction policies. And this is not new. I did not invent this. Kamal Shankar, I think, comes up with it first. Mark Rusinovich had an old blog post before Microsoft bought him out. Didier Stevens is still out there. I don't know who was here for ShmooCon Epilogue, but Kurt Schaefer and Judah Plummer spoke about this type of thing there. They spoke about it with respect to a little bit of AppLocker and mostly Bit 9, but it's the same type of thing going on. I've talked to them about integrating some of these other things. They weren't interested in SRP because they said basically it was too old. There's not a lot of those systems out there, and obviously with XP retiring that might be correct at this point. But again, I didn't want to leave you with the impression that I invented any of this stuff. I just copied stuff off the internet like everything else. So this is the code for GP Disable, and if you look you'll see in the middle there that word transparent enabled. So whenever we see transparent enabled as a call coming back, we're just going to intercept that and say status object name not found. We're going to return an error, and the kernel's going to say, oh, okay, it's an error. I guess I'll run the code. That's all that GP disable basically does. And GP disable was the Mark Rusinovich executable and DLL. And there's I've got the URL at the bottom there. So basically, if you have to bypass this, it's simple. You just run GP disable, and then the name of the thing that you want to bypass, boom, it runs. But if we're talking about software restriction policies, it might be the case that you can't run GP disable, which was the case recently. So now you have sort of chicken and egg situation. You know, I want to bypass the software restriction policies, but I can't run the thing that enables me to bypass the software restriction policies. In the particular case that I was looking at, DLLs were not being enforced, and I had a DLL for GP disable. I had that code, so all I needed to do was figure out how do I load the GP disable DLL and figure out how to get that done. Well, turns out that in this particular case, they had allowed Java because they needed to run things that ran on Java. So I had the ability to run Java, so I just needed to figure out a way to create a Java program that would load the GP disable DLL and execute all the things. And that was it. So ended up with this, and there's really only like 2 lines of active code in this thing. System load library GP disable, and then list of things that I would like to run after I do that that might be bypassed, or that might have been restricted by the software restriction policies. So how could you have mitigated this? Well, obviously, if they listed out every DLL and blacklisted or whitelisted only their good DLLs, then I wouldn't have been able to load my DLL either. My Java code would not have run. But blacklisting or whitelisting every DLL is hard. DLLs are changing all the time. Every time you update, you'd have to re-update the entire group policy. So they just looked at that and said, oh, that seems to be too hard. We're not going to do that. So again, all you needed was, you know, sort of one way in, one piece of software that I could use to execute code, and entire software restriction policies just drop. So then obviously, well, what about AppLocker? So it turns out AppLocker is even easier to bypass. They have a problem with installing new software if AppLocker is enabled. So they created a way to install software in an environment where AppLocker is enabled, and they just said to the installer, just use this code here to bypass the AppLocker. So it turns out, well, we can use that too. And same thing could be run. I created a console app that does that. You could also run it from an Office, Microsoft Office macro, VB, anything. I'll demo all of this. And on this particular case, there's a hotfix for this. So if you're running AppLocker in your enterprise and you expect it to not be bypassed, you would definitely want to install the Microsoft hotfix, but it's not, oddly enough, a critical security patch. So it's not the kind of thing that you'd normally see in the wild unless somebody knows, hey, this is going to be a problem for you, make sure you have this hotfix, right? So if you're on the blue side and you're doing defense and you're running AppLocker, you want to make sure to get that hotfix. But if you're on the red side and you're getting in, you're probably not going to see that in a standard environment. So that's the AppLocker bypass code. And the relevant part of this is, sorry, give me a second. Sandbox Inert, kind of see it in the middle. So get current process, create restricted token, H token, Sandbox Inert, and setting that Sandbox Inert flag is what tells AppLocker allow this. So basically all you have to do is set that, and then I just say the thing that I want to run, which in this case is calc.exe, and it runs. So, and again, the URL for that is on the bottom of the slide. I didn't come up with this either. I stole this off the internet. That's a general theme with me. I don't do any work. I just steal stuff off the internet. And this runs. By the way, when I was setting this up in the test environment, the initial thing I decided was, well, let me restrict from myself for testing purposes notepad.exe. Turns out it's really hard to program without Notepad. And it's a freaking waste of time. So that's why I ended up with calc. I was like, let me restrict something that I don't need this time. So second time around, I ended up with calc, which is what I'll use to demo this. And then we'll go into the demos. All right, kill this. I am going to have to reboot one of these things one time to show you one thing. So this is just Windows XP, obviously. This would also work. This is the software restriction policy demo part of it. This would work if it was Windows 7 running the software restriction policies instead of AppLocker, right? So this is the SRP side as opposed to the AppLocker side. It's not XP specific, but in order to draw the distinction, I'm going to run it on XP. So this over here is a shortcut to calc. It's still in the System32 subdirectory. So if I try to run calc and I double click on it, restricted. If I come down and open up a command prompt, and I say I want to run calc, system cannot execute, right? So restricted there. So what I can do is go to the desktop, and I'm going to say run GP disable, and the program that I'd like to run, calc. You with me so far? Calc. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned up at the top, you see I've got 3 VMs. The Windows Server 2008 is my domain box, right? That's where my group policies are being executed from. And I'm just signed in here as a regular user. I'm not admin in this VM right now. So this stuff is not my strong point, right? But basically there's.
You kept saying the kernel calls back to user space. Are you saying that application A goes down into the kernel pops back up, gets validation from some other user process, goes back down, and then says application yay verily you can go?
The answer is no. I don't understand it enough. Okay. But my understanding is it's just the application is going to make a call to a Windows API. And it's just going to go, and that goes to the kernel and says, am I allowed to run? And it comes back out. But that is going to transfer through user space where I have control of what goes in or what comes out. So I can't get into the kernel, but I don't have to. I think that's the way it goes. So I need to log off this one. And I'm just logging back in as Robert is a regular user. I notice if I don't do the log out and log back in, this next part just crashes the demo. All right, so what was I going to do next? The Java. So cd space / pro. And then I just do Java SRP bypass load, which is the name of the program I did that does that. Boom, calc. Same thing. And in Windows, come on, it shut down while I was waiting. So in Windows 7, so basically run calc, it's restricted. Run calc from the command prompt. Sorry. Restricted. And I can run, this is a shortcut to the app that I wrote the AppLocker Bypass, so AppBP, which is sitting in the program files. Double click on that, run it, calc. Yeah.
Do you know what happens on the back end for logging, alerting, and those things? Or is anything, I mean, if you have advanced logging set up?
Good question.
Trip anything?
I don't know.
Okay.
And then we have a Word document which has a macro in it. The way the macro works is I'm going to highlight the name of the thing I want to run, and then it's going to run it.
Bob, you can put this up on GitHub?
No.
I tried.
Say again?
I tried.
Right. Now, all the code's in the slides, actually. If I give you the slides, you'd have all the code. Or, I mean, just even the references, right? I stole all of it. So it's all out there. Yeah, exactly. So I think I Alt F11 this, come down in here, sub XP, hit F5, runs the macro calc. That's it. Did not demo fail. Any questions? Okay.
Right on time.
Thanks.
This has been a presentation of NoVA Hackers, brought to you by ComputeCycle, a Cranial Thunder production.